In the next couple of videos, I'm going to be building this lounge chair. For this first video, I'm going to be focusing on building the insert for the back and for the seat, which is going to be made by veneering some teak with some walnut inlays. For this design, I am trying to get it to look like the shape of a boat. The first step for making the seat inserts is to cut the veneer at the bandsaw and then plane them down to the final thickness of roughly 1/8 of an inch. I cut the veneer from 8/4 boards and tried to ensure that I would get consistent rift-sawn grain throughout the piece. I also kept the pieces in order so that I was able to do book matching across the entire seat insert. I then made sure to mark each of the pieces to know the correct orientation. With the veneers cut, I can now begin working on the panel for the seat inserts. This is going to be an MDF panel, edge banded with teak. The panels are going to be tapered, and I made a tapering jig to use at the table saw. When cutting out the panels, I'm going to make sure to keep the offcuts for later. Here I'm planing down the edge banding for the panels so that it is the same thickness as the MDF. I can then rip down the edge banding at the table saw. To glue on the edge banding, I am using the MDF offcuts as clamping cauls. Here I'm cutting off the excess edge banding at the table saw. Now I did have to add some extra strips because when I was measuring the edge banding, I measured the top distance and the bottom distance with the templates and didn't account for the curve. To cut the shape of the panels, I'm using the template for the outside veneer, and I've measured from the center to make sure that it is the right width. I can then mark the curves and bring it over to the bandsaw to roughly cut it out. After roughly cutting out the curve at the bandsaw, I'm using double-sided tape to stick the templates to the panel, and I will template route the curve. With the panels cut to size, I could then begin shaping the veneer pieces. For these pieces, I am going to start from the middle and work my way to the outside. After marking out the veneer, I took it over to the bandsaw to roughly cut it out. I'm going to leave these veneers slightly over length in case there is any discrepancies. With the veneer roughly cut, I can then begin final shaping using a spoke shave. For the veneers where there is a straight mating surface, I use my block plane to do that shaping. As I am shaping each of the veneer pieces, I'm bringing it over to my full-scale drawing to make sure that I have the right shape. As I am shaping the pieces, I am not looking for a perfect fit, and I'm aiming for about a 1/16 of an inch gap at the most. The reason for this is because I am going to come back with a router after I've glued the veneers to the panel in order to cut the slots for the walnut inlay. For the outside veneer pieces, I do not need to cut the outmost edge, as I can do that after the veneers have been glued to the panel. With all of the veneers shaped, I can then tape them together for the glue up. To glue the veneers to the MDF panel, I've just made a simple press using 2 pieces of 3/4 inch melamine and some curved clamping cauls. With a healthy amount of glue on the panel, I can then get adequate pressure to glue the veneers. I have also marked a center line on the MDF panel and on the top and bottom of the veneers, so that when I glue it together in the press, I can have proper alignment. When designing the seat inserts, I wanted them to look like the deck of a sailboat. Now, I know absolutely nothing about building a wood deck for a boat, so naturally, I watched many hours of YouTube videos explaining the process. What I learned from watching these videos is that I would not be able to implement the same process in building this chair. Specifically, the gaps on a wood boat deck are filled with silicone to allow for expansion and contraction of the wood. And I don't know about you, but typically I do not want to sit on a silicone surface. To mimic this design detail, I decided that I was going to cut grooves in between each of the veneers in order to inlay walnut to provide the necessary contrast. After leaving the panel glued up overnight, I can then remove the clamps. With the panel out of the press, I can then bring it over to the bandsaw and roughly cut the edges of the veneer. Then, using a flush trim bit at the router table, I can finish cleaning up the sides of the veneers for the panel. With the panels veneered, I can now begin working on the grooves for the walnut inlay. I'm going to start with the straight groove running down the middle of the panel. To cut the grooves, I am going to use my palm router and a 1/4 inch spiral bit. The distance from the edge of my router to the center of the bit is exactly 2 inches, so I'm setting up the fence 2 inches away from where I want the groove. With the fence set up, I could then cut the groove. For the curved grooves, I use my templates as the fence for the router. If you're enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and check out some of the other videos that I've made. The next video should be coming out shortly, and it will be finishing off this chair. With the grooves cut, I could then begin gluing in the walnut inlays. The grooves for these inlays were routed slightly deeper than the teak veneer so that there would be a good glue surface with the MDF. The walnut inlays are a 1/4 inch wide to fit in the 1/4 inch groove and are about a 1/2 inch thick to allow for clamping pressure. Given their thin width,
they are more than able to follow the curved contour of the grooves. For the inlays, I start in the outside grooves and work my way in. I did this in a few sessions so that I could come back and trim the excess of where the inlay meets in the middle. After the glue had dried on the inlays, I could then use a flush trimmed saw to cut off the excess from the bottom. With a chisel, I could cut out the excess of the curved inlays and use the sides of the straight groove as a reference. This will provide a clean mating surface for the center inlay. Here I am shaping the bottom of the center straight inlay where it meets at the end of two curved inlays. To do this, I'm just using a block plane on both sides of the inlay to bring it to a point in the center. I could then use a chisel to miter the ends of the two curved inlays to meet up with the center inlay. After test fitting and refining these points, I was able to get a good mating surface with no gaps. With these last inlays properly fitted, I could then glue them in. Now, I did do the veneer and inlays for both sides on the seat and the back. What I've been showing you in this video is mostly the process for doing one of the sides of the back. I really used the seat as my experiment to get the process down flat before recording. The bottom of the seat was my first shot, as this is likely never going to be seen unless the chair has catastrophically failed and ended up on its back. Admittedly, not all sides of the panel turned out perfectly, and there were some gaps that had to be filled. However, I like to think that really only one of the sides, the back panel facing outwards, is really ever going to be seen, as the chair will ultimately end up having cushions. Further, I am building this chair for my dad's birthday, and no matter how it turns out, he is obligated to like it. With the inlays glued in and cut to length, the next step is to bring them flush with the panel. I am using my jack plane to remove the bulk of the material. I could then use a block plane to remove any remaining high spots. Lastly, I can use my sander and 80 grit sandpaper to finish flushing up the veneer and remove any dried glue.
with the inserts for the chair bottom and back complete. In the next video, I'm going to be making the mahogany pieces of the rest of the chair, including shaping the arm and the front leg, and how those are going to be joined together.